Our speaker today is Danuta Donna Urbikas. Born in Coventry, England, she immigrated to the USA with her parents and sister in 1952, settling in Chicago, Illinois, and growing up in the Polish community. After attending Catholic grade schools and a public high school in Chicago, she graduated from the University of Illinois Chicago Circle with a degree in biology and began teaching high school biology. Donna is a graduate from the University of Chicago's Certificate Writing Program and has participated in many writing workshops and conferences. Currently, Donna is an award-winning author and finalist in the Chicago Writers Association, the Society of Midland Authors, the Midwest Book Awards as part of the Midwest Independent Publishers Association, and the bronze winner of Forward Indies Book Award. And you can see some of the copies of her book on the table there. So everyone, please welcome Donna Urbikas.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, wonderful. So so I wrote a book. And I'm going to give you a talk that's related to the story, and I did a lot of research on the history that's my family's history intertwined and kind of a related story of many people that came over to America as a result of World War II. So I did a lot of research on this. And I want to give you kind of a snapshot of Polish history. And there's a little video here that I'd like you to listen to that might capture all of that. So that kind of is a very quick overview of Polish history, which really began in 966 with the beginning of Christianity in Poland under King Mieszko I. So it's kind of sounds like a history of one war after another, which kind of has been the history. And also involves welcoming Jews to Poland in as early as 97, pardon me, with a painting that was done by Jan Matejko in the 1800s. And also, I'm just going to do some highlights of points in the history of Poland. And also a very significant part of Polish history involves Lithuania. And my husband was Lithuanian, that's why my last name is Urbikas, is a Lithuanian name. The marriage of King Jagiello with the Queen Jadwiga, a very significant, very strong alliance with Lithuania that started in 1385. A painting here showing Queen Jadwiga. She was a very famous, very well-loved queen of Poland. And then a very famous battle that solidified Poland and Lithuania's stronghold throughout Europe. At that point, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and it was an empire, went all the way from the Baltic to the Black Sea, which is something that you don't hear about very much. This was the emblem during this period of time. So then, of course, as you saw in the video, there were several partitions of Poland. Poland didn't really exist during these periods of time. There were three major ones. So if you have family that came over here, like we were talking a little earlier, like in the late 1800s, and your great-great-grandparents had birth certificates that said they were born in Russia or Germany, but they were speaking Polish, it's because they were in one of these partitions. This is a page from Norman Davies's book, God's Playground. He wrote this back in the late 80s, or actually early 80s. He's a historian that's not Polish even. He's from England, and he has a page showing how Poland looked during these different periods of time. And you can see on the top right, Poland doesn't exist during these periods of time because, the people were there, depending on who was occupying Poland, there may have been allowed to speak Polish or even maybe read Polish books and where my parents, where my mother's family in particular, they were not allowed to even read in Polish books. So it depended on, how things were in the local area. And so there were a lot of people that, were not educated. So yeah, the boundaries of Poland kind of literally went from, nothing to larger to smaller. So it depended on what time period you're talking about. So Polish history is very, very complicated, and that's part of the confusion of trying to talk about Poland. So here's some more maps. The one on the upper left is from Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands. Maybe you're familiar with that book. Again, you can't. There's no Poland there. I mean, and typically, and then you can see the bottom left here shows what it looks like today. But again, 1864, it looks, again, you don't see it. And then you can see the changing borders on the map on the far right. Of course, the white area always kind of retained itself through time. The map of Poland looked like this after World War I. However, very little part of it really had any kind of a connection with the Baltic Sea, which turned out to be a very hard way to exist because there was no real connection with shipping. It was very difficult for goods to get into Poland. And the area on the bottom that shows kind of a lighter purple contained the city of Lviv. And I point that out because of what's going on today in Ukraine. The city of Lviv was Lviv, and that was, very Polish during the interwar years. In 1918, it was impossible to delineate a clear distinction between Poles and Ukrainians. And there were continued battles. And, I point this out because today, in spite of all the fighting that had been going on, in fact, older generations of Poles really had a big argument with Ukrainians because there were a lot of Poles killed, and there was a lot of retaliation. So that has gone away. A lot of Poles have opened their homes to a lot of Ukrainian refugees. So, and there were a lot of anti-communist activities going on in Ukraine after the war. So it's kind of interesting to see how things have turned around between Polish and Ukrainian relationships. And of course, Poles definitely did not want anything to do with being occupied by either Germany or Russia. And you still see this, when there was the 100-year, really it wasn't 100 years of independence because, of course, communist Russia was, occupying Poland after World War II. But you see, parades showing flags like this in Poland. So it was, still. Anyway, so Poland looked like this after World War I, and it was surrounded by the Soviet Union, and it was a difficult transition after World War I. And depending on what part of the country you were in, my mother and my half sister were up in the upper right-hand side of it, which today is Belarus, and my father was in the south part of Poland. So World War II broke out in September 1st of '39 with the invasion of Warsaw primarily. There's a photo of the castle in Warsaw when it first was hit. And, the newspapers carried that whole story, and the Germans quickly invaded that little tiny bit of Poland that was, going into, contacting the Baltic, and very quickly fell. There's a really good book out, came out a few years ago, describing that whole thing, that whole invasion by Roger Morehouse, if you're interested. And one of the things that he says there, that Poland has been a blind spot in Western history books. It's just not really talked about as much. So it's sort of coming back into, um, people's attention in the last recent years. So it's kind of interesting. Here's a website that you can check out his work. The other thing that also happened that, like 2 weeks later, that isn't really talked about in school, is that the Soviets invaded, and I emphasize invaded Poland. My mother and sister were caught up in this on September 17th, and my mother was near the city of Grodno, which is that eastern part of Poland. At that time, eastern part. Today, it's Belarus. And the Soviets will say that they were liberating Poland, and they will still say that today if you talk to some of the Russians, and they were never taught that that was invasion. It's just like today, Putin saying that they're having a military operation in Ukraine. That they're not calling it a war, they're calling it a military operation. Just like back then, they were saying they quote, liberated Poland. They were liberating it from the Germans. And that was their thinking. But very clearly, they invaded, and my mother certainly was part of that. So, newspaper headline here in Chicago was invasion. So, how did that happen? I have the same map on the table here from my author friend Wesley Adamczyk, who provided this for me. He's no longer, but he went through the same ordeal that my mother and sister had gone through. Anyway, there was a very telling pact by the Soviets and the Nazis. It was called the Molotov Pact that was signed on August 23rd, 1939. And in it, there was a secret protocol that they agreed to divide up Poland, more or less along the lines that you see there. And that that was a secret to divide up Poland. Now, you don't learn about that necessarily either in the history of World War II. And so this is what ended up happening. My mother is pictured here, and this is a translation from what she wrote about or told me about, and I have her on tape in Polish, which I translated here, how she was deported. There were 4 waves of deportations, and she was in the first one, which was extremely difficult because that was in the middle of a very cold winter in 1940. And basically, they came and knocked on her door at 4 o'clock in the morning, and gave her like an hour, which is amazing. It was even an hour to gather up her things, and she didn't have much left, by the way. At that point, she had a farm. She had a fruit farm in that eastern part of Poland, and gather up the few things she had left because her property had been ransacked at that point, and so she didn't have much food left or clothing or anything. And she gathered up my sister, and they were put on a wagon, taken to the train station. The estimates of all of these deportations are kind of varied. It depends on who you talk to. Some people will say we're up to 2 million. That's kind of questionable, but certainly at least 1 million. And then why were these people taken? So in my mother's case, for her first husband, my sister's father, had fought in World War I, particularly the defining battle. Remember all those border disputes. So one of them was a defining battle in Warsaw in 1920 against the Soviets. And so he was one of the soldiers, and also her brother was in that battle. And it was her brother's inheritance that she got because he died rather young. So one of the things that was happening when Poland finally rid itself and got established after World War I is they were giving land to all these military people. They were military settlers, and that's how she ended up in eastern Poland, because really she came from around Warsaw, the city of Radom. And they were giving all these, to reward these, and they wanted the patriotic Poles to be in that part of the country. So she essentially was a landowner, and that was one of her so-called crimes. So she was, had a husband who was, part of the military. She was a landowner, but also they deported anybody who was, a priest or an officer or a judge, anybody who was educated. And why? Because they really wanted free slave labor, and they didn't. There was no trial. There was no, any kind of legal procedure. They just knocked on the doors, literally with a gun, a bayonet, and said, "Go get on the wagon. We've already had a trial. You're supposed to go, and that's it. No explanation." So yeah, so they went on, wagons in the middle of the night and on a sled later after it was a very long train ride originally she ended up in Siberia, later on she ended up in Russia. So yeah, and they took them to, these are pictures from the internet, they're not hers. Something like this, a barrack, was a very flimsy barrack that may have, they had some cots for, and just gave them very flimsy blankets, and maybe there was one or two wood burning stoves in there, gave them very measly meals, and they told them to work. And she had been separated from my sister's father at that point, so he wasn't there, so she had to go out, leave my sister, who was 5, in the barrack and in the camp there, and go out and work. And her job was to cut down, or well, actually not cut the trees down so much because they were huge trees, but the other workers, usually the men, would cut down the trees, and she had to cut off the branches of the trees. And it was, freezing cold, and she really didn't have much to wear. And that was kind of, her job. And people died left and right. And it was very common for young children who did make it on the wintry train ride most children under the age of 5 did die. And people got sick from various diseases. I mean, ticks and lice in particular were a huge problem. They were just everywhere. And, this crowded mass of people, and it was very unsanitary conditions. So it was just amazing that, they managed to make it through. So this is, my family story, but it's also the story of many, many people there. So the other part of the story that doesn't get told very much in history is that my father, who was a Polish Army officer, was called up literally the day before Hitler attacked, and he was captured also in the eastern part of Poland, and he was interned in Lithuania and then sent to a POW camp in Russia that was part of the Katyn forest. And this is also something that doesn't get told in history books, and certainly Russians weren't taught this. And certainly the people in Poland weren't after World War II, because the Soviets weren't gonna teach it to them. Certainly wasn't taught here. That there were like over 22,000 officers, intellectuals, who were murdered by the Russians, and they blamed the Germans for this. And they did not admit to that until like 1990, when communism fell. And they were buried, and here's a picture of one of the grave sites that actually the Germans uncovered in 1943. And my father just was one of like 300 or 400 officers that wasn't part of that mass shooting, because he had just gotten to the camp. It was called Kozelsk or Kozelsk in Russian, and he was kind of big and strong, and he was being taken to work to the north. They were building a airstrip on the north side. So, but there were, again, these were people that the Russians were, I keep saying Russians, but the Soviets were trying to eliminate anybody that was educated and could, argue against them. And there's an incredibly telling memorial in New Jersey City that shows this whole massacre. If you're ever there, it's this is just one side of it. But anyway, I thought it was kind of interesting. It's by a Polish artist, sculptor. So the other thing that doesn't, that kind of upsets a lot of Polish people is that there were German concentration camps, and they were Nazi camps. They're on occupied Poland. Poland's government had it to escape Poland because they were being sought out, and so eventually they ended up in London. So it was the Polish government in London that was trying to manage things. So Poland was really occupied throughout the whole war, and the Germans set up all these different concentration camps in Poland. So anybody that says they were Polish camps, it really upsets a lot of Polish people because they were not Polish camps; they were German camps. And then the Polish government was trying to warn the world that what was going on, this extermination of the Jews. This report came out from London in 1942, and was largely ignored. Then there was also an officer, Jan Karski. He was actually a courier. I don't know if he was actually an officer. He was a courier, and he tried to report this whole atrocity of the extermination of the Jews in the ghetto. And he traveled even to talk to Franklin Roosevelt, to tell him, and was ignored. And he wrote this story of him is written here in this book that came out fairly last few years. There's a huge foundation about him and what he did. There was even a PBS David Strathairn did a very good enactment of this story. I think it, may still be up on the the channels. You may still be able to catch this. He does a marvelous job of playing Karski, and his encounter with Roosevelt. Everybody in America loves Franklin Roosevelt, but a lot of Polish people really don't because of the way he ignored things. There's another fellow, Witold Pilecki. He was an officer. He actually volunteered to go into Auschwitz because he wanted to report what was going on there. He did it twice. And he was gathering information and sneaking notes out. I just read this book, The Volunteer. It's a really hard read, I'll have to tell you. But he was reporting on the conditions at Auschwitz. And again, it was ignored. It was just, there were bigger things to deal with World War II. Eventually he got out, at the end of the war, and he went back to Poland, and guess what? The Soviets ended up killing him. So, it's just one, it's like a story that you don't hear about. Oh, and by the way, they're going to be doing a movie again about him. There's coming out, the woman that did, the producer that did 1917 is going to be doing that. That one's coming out. So I don't know when, but that's been all over the news lately. So you might want to catch that one. In 1941, Germany, instead of staying with Russia, invades Russia in 1941, Operation Barbarossa. And that changes everything for the Polish people that were enslaved in Siberia and in Russia, and also for people, for the soldiers that were like my father in the camps. The Polish government is, in exile in London. So-called amnesty. That's the agreement that they formed. That there could be a Polish army formed on, Soviet soil, and that all the people that were in the camps, like my mother, would be released, and they could, follow. Usually they went to follow the Polish army because that was the only way that they could get any kind of shelter or food. So General Władysław Anders was the Polish general who was had been in prison in Lubyanka prison in Moscow, and he was let out, and he was given permission to form this army under the agreement that the British also were participating in. In fact, they were the ones that were funding the Polish army. And so my father, don't know how, but he managed to get a camera early on, and he started taking pictures of the camps. And this is so you can see the top one is the 10th camp that was at Tatyshevo, which was the first one that the soldiers were gathering in, and then the next one shows them on horseback. My father was in the cavalry in the Polish army. And then the one at the bottom here shows the ragtag Polish army before they got there. They were just coming out of the camps. They have like rags on their feet, and it was very cold. By then it was November of 41. And then my father's carrying his friend's casket over there, and then they were getting onto trains. They were all cattle cars. They weren't passenger cars, and going on to different parts of the USSR, basically trying to gather up all the soldiers that they could gather and start, training to go fight Hitler. So his track was basically through, from Tatyshevo was through different parts of the USSR, eventually through the Middle East and Italy, and then to England. And I have this map in my book that shows his track and my mother's, and they met in between a couple of different places. They met at that first camp in Tatyshevo near Saratov, and then they met again later on in Jalabad in the USSR. It's, quite a story, actually. Some more pictures of my father. He was a lieutenant. And then the one on the end is already in Italy with his police dog. He ended up in the military police at the end of the war. The cover from one of his albums. I've got like 6 or 7 of his albums. It shows his army insignias glued on top. Now, in my mother's and sister's case, it was a little different. In the labor camp, they at least had a little bit of a roof over their heads, and they had some food. This is, like most of the people that were there, she did, get maybe a 1 or 2 pound loaf of bread. That's how much she got so-called paid for her work. And then, she could go forage in the forest for, berries or, mushrooms or something like that. And then she could also she would also go and work on the local farmer's field and, dig for potatoes. And she would dig so many potatoes, she would get a sack of potatoes, that kind of thing. So she was able to supplement the food a little bit. But when she got out of the camp, there was none of that, because there were hundreds of other people that were trying to get out. They were trying to find their way out of the USSR, and they were traveling across the whole reaches of a desolate land, and it was also getting to be cold. And basically all these people were trying to find a place on one of the collective farms, that anybody that would take them. So, and they had very little money. I mean, it got to the point where they had absolutely nothing. And so it was extremely difficult to even survive that. And along the way, many people died. I mean, it was just, the disease and the lack of food and shelter. Luckily, my mother reached out to my father, and he was able to send her a little bit of money, so that, he really basically saved them. But anyway, her trek ended up being, finally ending up, after all of that, through, the Middle East, and ended up in India, which is quite a story there. Here's some more pictures of my father, from my father's album, through that whole ordeal, which is kind of like where my mother went, and the picture of one of the farmers. That's kind of how they looked back then. and that's how they lived, in these little thatch, huts on the ground, pretty typical of what they look like. This is my mother's written in Russian that gives her permission to leave, the camp. Although she actually had to escape because the Russians didn't want to let these people go. They had free slave labor. Why would they want them to go? So she actually had to kind of escape. But she was a pretty cunning woman. She had a lot of survival skills that came up from her. I mean, she was only 27 when she was deported, so she really, she had a child to deal with. My sister is pictured there, and so they made it to Tehran. My sister is pictured there with her haircut because she was very, very sick, and like I said, the lice were a huge problem, so they shaved her hair, and that's all that grew back at that point. And then there was my mother with a friend in India. She was a Red Cross nurse at one of the children's orphanage hospitals. So I write about all this in my book. If you want, I have a few copies to, what did I do? to purchase if you'd like. I'll sign it for you. There's my website. It has a lot more information if you're interested. I have a video of my sister interviewed. The U.S. Holocaust Museum actually interviewed her. And so I have, more information there. I don't sell my book on there. So another thing that doesn't get told in history classes is that Poland was really betrayed. It was betrayed by the powers to be in World War II. It was always considered the Polish question. It wasn't. You don't see them pictured here, in all these talks. Of course, by Potsdam in 1945, Roosevelt wasn't there because he had died, and Truman came in instead. But they were all negotiating. Poland was kind of a chess piece in the world of war, and they were talking about how to divvy up things, and they just wanted to get the war over with, and they didn't care how or whatever happened to Poland. Another point of history that gets lost. You may have seen the movie about the Enigma code, and it's all about Alan Turing. But it was really these guys that did it, the Polish guys, and they don't get mentioned. Come on, maybe their names are too hard to pronounce or something. I don't know, but Turing really finalized it, but they did it, and so again, the history that doesn't get told. Another thing that Poles don't get credit for in the history books is the battle at Monte Casino. My father was in this battle, okay? And and the Polish troops that were in this battle were significantly important to winning this battle. It was a huge, bloody battle. And do we hear about it, what the Polish participation was? No. Here's another thing you don't hear about. Is the Polish forces. There's General Sikorsky, who was murdered. Well, a lot of Polish people say he was murdered. His plane, mysteriously got taken down later. The Polish pilots were really daredevils. They were tremendous daredevils. So, yeah, Poland's role during World War II. You had Poland, having to escape to London. Poland was occupied by Germany and Russia. Poland was the only country that if Polish people helped Jews, hid Jews, the whole family would be executed. That was the only country. That didn't happen in any of the other countries. And there was just no representation, really. In fact, in 1946, when the London Victory Parade what happened, this was a big bone of contention with families like mine and many of my friends' parents who were military, who were professional military. They weren't allowed to participate in this parade. Why? Because nobody wanted to upset Uncle Joe, Stalin. There was a parade a few years ago, but everybody was very old or gone. So again, this kind of slap in the face of Polish people. So one thing that maybe, why are Polish people found all over the world? Well, for one thing, in my case, in my family's case, is my father wasn't going to go back to communist Poland. He would have been sent back to Siberia, or he would have been killed. That's what happened to a lot of his friends. Never heard from him again. What was my mother supposed to do? Her land, even if she had, her documents were lost during that whole turmoil that she went through. But even if she had them, her farm was no longer in Poland. It was Belarus. So what to go back to? It was a very inefficient economic system. Communism, was, loss of political freedoms. What was considered the true Polish government was in London. So you have Polish people all over the world, everywhere. A lot of them stayed in Kazakhstan. And this is an old graphic, but it kind of shows the distribution of Poles everywhere. Even in South America. My father almost went to South America, to Argentina, I believe. So anyway, Jews, the same thing. Like I said earlier, a lot of settlements first came, in the early part of Poland's history. A lot of them were invited to come, especially merchants, because the kings in the early years wanted them to handle business, because they, the so-called nobility wasn't going to do that kind of work. They wanted merchants to do that. Very prosperous period, in the 1500s and later on. So the Jewish population grew. And, Jews were in Poland for 1,000 years, and everybody got along just fine. And then there were the partitions, so that, Poland didn't exist for 123 years, technically. And there was assimilation until, of course, World War II. And in the beginning of World War II, there were like 3 million Jews. And then after World War II, 300,000 maybe. And then after that, a lot of them left to go to Israel. And who knows how many today, maybe 20,000? So looking at communist Poland, a view from America, up until 1989, there were lots of shortages. There was a thriving black market, very curtailed opportunities, loss of freedom, oppression of ethnic groups, especially Jews. The Catholic Church was actually pretty powerful, especially when John Paul became Pope in 1978. There were riots. My first trip to Poland was in 1976, and that was a real eye-opener for me growing up in America, to be subjected to what it was like to be, standing in line for hours waiting for things to buy. I speak fluent Polish, but didn't make any difference. So there's an impact of World War II on Poland and the surrounding area. Survival really did depend on the Catholic Church and the ties to the Catholic Church. The communists allowed the Catholic Church to thrive because they knew that if they didn't, there was really going to be upheaval. There was a thriving black market. You could get goods, you'd get to pay for them pretty handily, but it was like a real economy. It was, you could get stuff. A lot of people belonged to the Communist Party in name only, so they could, be left alone, basically. Then in the 1970s, maybe even earlier, there started to be food strikes, labor strikes, especially when Pope John Paul visited in 1979. He kind of encouraged things, and then, of course, there was continuing social unrest until you had the Solidarity movement, which really led to the final demise of communism in Poland. So Poland picked itself up and started a sink-or-swim strategy to the economy, literally. Went through a lot of growing pains. And then the EU in 2004 came in when Poland became part of it, and really helped a lot, and that really made a big difference to Poland's economy. There was an article back in 2017 that really, showed how, as of then, Poland's, increase in the economic indicators was like 4% a year. That's really amazing. Of course, now, because of COVID and just they got, they did take a hit on all the immigrants that they've been taking in lately. It's really gone down, but it is expected to be like 2.7 in 2014. Inflation did take a hit. Now it's around 11%. But Polish people are very entrepreneurial. Everybody wants like a little ice cream shop on the corner or something, but technology is really big. And people are very, very highly educated. So, there's elections coming up, so we'll see what happens there. Right now, Poland's a bit autocratic, and it has been very nationalistic, so a little bit of social unrest been going on. You may have heard in the news, things are not always as calm as they might have been. There's always, somebody protesting something. Last time I was in Poland, which has been a few years, like 2018 was the last time I was there. There's always someone protesting somewhere. But anyway, that's kind of it. And it always brings back something that always is what makes me wonder, like, what does home mean? I grew up here, but I grew up in the Polish community, and I went to Polish school on Saturdays and Polish Girl Scouts in the afternoon and all of that. But actually, I consider myself, American from Polish descent, and I've taught my children, a lot about being Polish and all that. But I consider myself American. So yeah. So that's my talk. I'll take any questions.